The year was 1536, and the scent of death hung heavy over the Tower of London like morning fog over the Thames. In the shadow of those ancient stone walls, a queen sat in her cell, knowing that each sunrise brought her closer to an appointment with the executioner's blade. But this was no ordinary prisoner awaiting her fate. This was Anne Boleyn, the woman who had toppled a dynasty, shattered England's relationship with Rome, and captured the heart of the most dangerous king in Europe. What makes Anne's story so compelling is not just the brutality of her end, but the audacity of her rise. Here was a woman who dared to say no to Henry VIII when queens were expected to be silent ornaments. She demanded marriage when others offered mere mistresses' arrangements. She challenged the established order when conformity meant survival. And for a brief, glorious moment, she won everything: crown, throne, and the obsessive devotion of a king who would move heaven and earth to possess her. But power in Tudor England was as fleeting as it was intoxicating. The same qualities that elevated Anne to the throne, her wit, her independence, her refusal to be controlled, would ultimately seal her doom. For in Henry's world, love and hate were separated by the thinnest of margins, and the king who had defied the Pope to make her queen would prove equally willing to destroy her when she failed to serve his purposes. Today, we're going to examine the dark journey that led from Henry's passionate pursuit to Anne's final walk to the scaffold. This isn't just another tale of royal romance gone wrong. It's the story of a woman caught between her own ambitions and the impossible expectations of a tyrant king. We'll explore the fatal miscalculations that transformed England's most desired woman into its most expendable queen, and reveal how Anne's tragedy became the blueprint for royal terror that would haunt the Tudor court for generations. The story begins not with love at first sight, but with a calculated game of power that would consume them both. Anne Boleyn arrived at Henry's court in 1522, not as some naive country girl, but as a sophisticated young woman who had been educated in the most refined courts of Europe. She had served in the household of Margaret of Austria and later in the French court, absorbing lessons in politics, culture, and the dangerous art of courtly intrigue. When Anne returned to England, she entered a world where the king's marriage to Catherine of Aragon had already begun to show cracks. Catherine, despite her dignity and piety, had failed to provide Henry with the male heir he desperately craved. Their only surviving child was Mary, and in Henry's mind, a daughter could never secure the Tudor dynasty against the threats that surrounded England. The king's eyes had begun to wander, seeking not just physical satisfaction, but the possibility of a new wife who might succeed where Catherine had failed. Anne Boleyn was everything Catherine was not. Where the Spanish queen was devout and submissive, Anne was sharp-tongued and challenging. Where Catherine accepted her fate with resigned grace, Anne actively shaped her destiny. Most crucially, where Catherine had learned to endure Henry's displeasure, Anne learned to cultivate his obsession. The early stages of their relationship reveal the calculating nature of both parties. Henry, already experienced in the art of royal seduction, expected Anne to follow the familiar pattern of court mistresses, grateful for royal attention, easily satisfied with gifts and temporary favor, and ultimately disposable when his interest waned. But Anne refused to play by these established rules. When Henry offered her the traditional role of mistress, she declined with a mixture of moral righteousness and strategic brilliance that caught the king completely off guard. Her famous letter to Henry, written sometime around 1526, demonstrates the sophisticated game she was playing. Rather than expressing gratitude for his attention or eagerness for his bed, Anne wrote with studied ambiguity, neither encouraging nor entirely rejecting his advances. She understood that Henry's interest would only intensify if she remained just out of reach, and she crafted her responses to maintain that delicate balance between availability and virtue. This strategy worked beyond her wildest dreams. Henry, a accustomed to immediate gratification in all things, found himself confronting a woman who demanded nothing less than marriage before surrendering herself. For a king who had grown bored with easy conquests, Anne's resistance became an irresistible challenge. He began to pursue her with an intensity that shocked even the cynical courtiers who had witnessed decades of royal infidelity. The letters Henry wrote to Anne during this period reveal a man transformed by desire into something approaching desperation. He promised her his heart, his throne, and his eternal devotion. He swore that she alone possessed the power to make him happy, and he begged for even the smallest tokens of her affection with a humility that would have been unimaginable from the proud young king who had ascended the throne 17 years earlier. But Henry's promises came with a terrible price. To marry Anne, he would have to set aside Catherine of Aragon, his wife of nearly 20 years. This wasn't simply a matter of royal convenience. It required challenging the authority of the Pope, who had originally granted the dispensation that allowed Henry to marry his brother's widow. The theological and political implications were staggering, potentially isolating England from Catholic Europe and inviting foreign invasion. Yet Henry convinced himself that his marriage to Catherine had been cursed by God from the beginning. He found passages in Leviticus that seemed to condemn marriages between brothers-in-law, and he interpreted Catherine's failure to produce male heirs as divine punishment for their union. What had begun as romantic obsession gradually transformed into religious conviction, with Anne as both the prize and the justification for overturning centuries of tradition. The process of annulling Henry's first marriage consumed years and ultimately reshaped the religious landscape of England. Cardinal Wolsey, Henry's most trusted advisor, found himself caught between his king's demands and Rome's refusal to grant the annulment. The cardinal's failure to deliver the divorce he had promised cost him his position, his wealth, and ultimately his life, demonstrating the lethal consequences of disappointing Henry in matters touching Anne Boleyn. As the legal battle dragged on, Anne's position at court became increasingly precarious. She was not yet queen, but she was clearly more than a mistress. Courtiers struggled to navigate the complex etiquette of addressing a woman who might someday wear the crown, but currently held no official title. Foreign ambassadors reported home about the unusual influence wielded by this upstart daughter of a minor nobleman, while Catherine's supporters viewed Anne as nothing more than a scheming adventuress who had bewitched their beloved queen's husband. The pressure on Anne during this period was immense. She had staked everything on becoming Henry's wife, burning bridges with potential suitors and making powerful enemies among Catherine's faction. If Henry's interest had cooled, or if Rome had successfully prevented the annulment, Anne would have found herself isolated and vulnerable, with few protectors and many enemies eager for revenge. But Anne had chosen her path, and she pursued it with remarkable determination. She cultivated relationships with reform-minded clerics who supported the king's break from Rome, positioning herself as the symbol of England's religious independence. She surrounded herself with scholars and theologians who could provide intellectual justification for Henry's actions, transforming what might have been seen as mere lust into a principled stand for royal sovereignty. The breakthrough came in 1533, when Henry secretly married Anne despite the ongoing legal complications. She was already pregnant, and the promise of a male heir had pushed the king beyond the point of caution. Thomas Cranmer, the newly appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, declared Henry's marriage to Catherine null and void, clearing the way for Anne's coronation as queen. The ceremony that made Anne Boleyn queen was a masterpiece of political theater, designed to demonstrate that her elevation was not merely the whim of an infatuated king, but the righteous correction of a theological error. The pageantry was magnificent, yet beneath the golden spectacle lay profound anxiety. Anne processed through London's streets in a litter of cloth of gold, but the crowds that gathered were notably subdued. Unlike the joyous celebrations that had greeted Catherine of Aragon decades earlier, Anne's coronation was met with polite silence, from subjects who remained deeply attached to their discarded queen. Many still viewed Catherine as their rightful sovereign, seeing Anne as an interloper who had stolen another woman's throne through manipulation and sorcery. The religious ceremony itself carried unprecedented political weight. As Archbishop Cranmer placed the crown upon Anne's head, he was not merely elevating a new queen, but formally declaring England's independence from papal authority. Every gesture, every prayer, every blessing represented a rejection of Rome's spiritual supremacy. Anne Boleyn's coronation was simultaneously a wedding celebration and a declaration of war against the established order of Christendom. Yet even in her moment of triumph, dark clouds gathered on the horizon. The child Anne carried, the heir whose promise had driven Henry to such desperate measures, was born in September 1533. But instead of the longed-for prince, Anne delivered a daughter, Elizabeth. The disappointment was crushing, not just for Henry, but for Anne herself, who understood that her value to the king rested entirely on her ability to produce male heirs. Henry masked his frustration with public declarations of joy, but those close to the court detected the chill that had entered the royal marriage. The king had sacrificed his relationship with the Pope, alienated half of Europe, and plunged England into religious upheaval, all for a son who had not materialized. Anne's failure to deliver the promised prince represented more than personal disappointment. It called into question the divine approval that Henry believed had blessed their union. The early years of Anne's queenship revealed the impossible position she occupied. As queen, she was expected to provide counsel and support to her husband. Yet Henry's temperament made such partnership extraordinarily dangerous. The king had grown increasingly volatile as he aged, his legendary charm giving way to explosive rages and unpredictable mood swings. Courtiers who had once competed for royal attention now walked carefully, understanding that today's favorite could become tomorrow's victim. Anne's sharp intelligence, which had initially attracted Henry, now became a source of friction. She continued to express opinions on matters of state, to challenge policies she disagreed with, and to advocate for causes she supported. In a mistress, such behavior might have been tolerated as amusing impertinence. In a queen, it was viewed as dangerous overreach that threatened the natural order of royal authority. The miscarriages that followed Elizabeth's birth transformed Anne's position from precarious to desperate. Each failed pregnancy was not merely a personal tragedy, but a political catastrophe that weakened her hold on the throne. Henry had broken with Rome based on his conviction that God wanted him to have male heirs through Anne. When those heirs failed to materialize, it became increasingly difficult to maintain that their marriage enjoyed divine blessing. By 1535, the king's behavior toward his wife had grown openly hostile. Foreign ambassadors reported heated arguments between the royal couple, with Henry's volcanic temper directed at the woman who had once been able to calm his fury with a smile. Anne, for her part, seemed to recognize the growing danger of her situation, but her attempts to regain Henry's affection only highlighted how thoroughly their relationship had deteriorated. The emergence of Jane Seymour at court provided Henry with a new focus for his romantic obsessions. Plain where Anne had been beautiful, submissive where Anne was assertive, Jane represented everything the king had grown to despise about his current wife. The pattern was depressingly familiar. Henry's courtship of Jane followed the same progression that had once elevated Anne, complete with passionate letters and promises of eternal devotion. Anne watched this transformation with the horrified fascination of someone seeing her own doom approach. She had played this game before, from the other side, and she understood better than anyone how it would end. The king who had once defied Europe to possess her was now prepared to destroy her for another woman, and the precedent she had helped establish by displacing Catherine would now be used against her with lethal efficiency. The charges that would eventually seal Anne's fate were already taking shape in Henry's mind long before her arrest. Adultery, incest, treason. These accusations would provide the legal framework for eliminating an inconvenient queen. But the real crime Anne had committed was far simpler and more tragic. She had failed to remain the fantasy that Henry's obsession had created. The real woman, with her opinions and failures and human limitations, could never match the idealized figure the king had constructed in his imagination. As 1536 dawned, Anne Boleyn found herself trapped in a nightmare of her own making. The same ruthless ambition that had elevated her above all other women in England now worked against her with implacable logic. She had taught Henry that queens could be discarded when they failed to serve royal purposes, and now that lesson would be applied to her with surgical precision. The machinery of destruction was already in motion, driven by a king whose capacity for self-deception was matched only by his talent for cruelty. Anne had gambled everything on maintaining Henry's love, but she had failed to understand that for this king, love and hatred were merely different expressions of the same consuming need for absolute control. The trap that would ensnare Anne Boleyn was constructed with the methodical precision of a master craftsman. Henry's paranoia, always simmering beneath the surface of his regal composure, had reached a fever pitch by early 1536. The king, who had once hung on Anne's every word, now scrutinized her every gesture for signs of betrayal, her every conversation for evidence of disloyalty. In his twisted logic, the woman who had once captivated him through wit and independence now threatened his authority through those same qualities. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's calculating chief minister, recognized the political winds shifting around the doomed queen. The man who had helped orchestrate the fall of Thomas More and John Fisher understood that survival in Henry's court required an almost supernatural ability to anticipate the king's desires before Henry himself fully formed them. Cromwell had watched Anne's influence wane with each failed pregnancy, each heated argument with the king, each moment when her presence reminded Henry of promises unfulfilled and expectations unmet. Anne Boleyn's story remains one of history's most chilling reminders that in the game of absolute power, even queens are expendable pieces. Her tragedy was not simply that she failed to produce a male heir, but that she dared to believe she could maintain her humanity while navigating the inhuman demands of Tudor politics. The woman who had once made a king grovel for her affections discovered too late that Henry's love was merely another form of possession. And when possession became inconvenient, destruction followed with terrifying efficiency. Her legacy lived on through her daughter Elizabeth, proving that sometimes the greatest victory comes not from surviving the monster, but from ensuring that what we build outlasts the forces that seek to destroy us.